Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Hope you had a fantastic weekend. We appreciate you being with me here on what I call my morning musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I'm currently in the midst of responding to an article by the scholar by the name of William Lane Craig. He's a great apologist for the Christian faith, has done some wonderful debating against atheists and what have you. Well, a little while back, he wrote an article entitled Orthodox Preterist. And he said, I'm still exploring amillennialism and postmillennialism. And he said, I reject hyper-preterism. Now, this was written back in 2009, but it was only just recently sent to me. I was unaware of it. But we have examined two of his reasons for rejecting the preterist view. Now, keep in mind that he is addressing, to a certain extent, the partial preterist view of Gentry, DeMar, etc., etc. But, of course, he believes that his objections to the partial preterist view are also valid objections to the true preterist view as well. His third objection is based upon the doctrine of the resurrection. And he said, remember that in 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul says Christ himself will descend from heaven with a shout of command, and the archangels call, and the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise. 1 Corinthians 15, he says the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. Paul connected the return of Christ to the resurrection of the dead, the destruction of death itself. Now, Paul's letters were written prior to AD 70. 1 Thessalonians and 1 Corinthians were written in the 50s. So what the preterist has to say here is that Paul was looking forward to some other event than the event predicted by Jesus of Nazareth in his Olivet Discourse, ! Unquote. Now, keep in mind that Dr. Craig is addressing the partial preterist view. The partial preterist view says Matthew 24:29 and following, the coming of Christ at the sound of the trumpet was AD 70. Paul predicted the coming of Christ with the sound of the trumpet in Thessalonians and Corinthians, but even the partial preterist says that is the resurrection. So Dr. Craig says, look, you cannot delineate between Jesus' teaching in the Olivet Discourse and what Paul says in Thessalonians and in Corinthians. Therefore, the partial preterists, such as Dr. Gentry, DeMar, etc., per Dr. Craig's argument, since you cannot delineate between Matthew 24, Thessalonians, and Corinthians, that nullifies the partial preterist view. Well, I agree with Dr. Craig on this. I find no justification whatsoever for the partial preterist view that Paul in Thessalonians and Corinthians was speaking of a different coming of the Lord at the sounding of a trumpet, different from what Jesus talked about in Matthew 24. And here's really a major deal. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 15, Paul said, now this I say to you by the word of the Lord. Now, as I point out in my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, the Wedding of the King of Kings. Even Dr. Kenneth Gentry admits that the majority of scholars see this as Paul saying, I'm reminding you of what Jesus said. And yet, here we have Paul saying, I'm reminding you in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 of what Jesus said in his eschatological discourse, Matthew 24. And yet Dr. Gentry says and teaches that 1 Thessalonians 4 is actually different from what Jesus taught in Matthew 24. This is incredibly inconsistent. I fully accept the reality, the exegetical reality, that 1 Thessalonians 4, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 speak about the same time and the same events as foretold by Jesus in Matthew 24, 29 and following. But what does that mean? That means unequivocally that the coming of the Lord at the sound of the trumpet, and we'll have more to say about the sounding of the trumpet later on, but it means unequivocally that the coming of the Lord at the sound of the trumpet for the gathering of the dead was to be in Jesus' generation. Jesus spoke of His coming, the coming of the Son of Man, and we'll have more to say about that, the coming of the Son of Man at the sounding of the trumpet, and He said, "Verily I say unto you, this generation." He did not say some far off generation. He said this generation will by no means, double negative, will by no means pass away until all of these things are fulfilled. So, I accept Dr. William Lane Craig's argument that he posed against the partial preterist view in arguing and saying you cannot delineate between what Jesus said and what Paul said. They are the same coming, they are the same time, they are the same resurrection. I accept that as true and valid because Paul said, "Brethren, I'm only reminding you of what Jesus said." But that means unequivocally that coming of the Son of Man was to be in Jesus' generation. Dr. William Lane Craig has therefore not only falsified his own argument, he has effectively falsified the partial preterist view. We've got a whole lot more in our examination of Dr. William Lane Craig's objections to the partial preterist view. But in the meantime, you really need to get a copy of this book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings. It is the only commentary on 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 13 and following that I'm aware of, written from the full preterist, the true preterist perspective that has ever been produced. Go to my website, www.eschatology.org or BibleProphecy.com. Order the book, say that you mention that you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll refund the shipping. Saves you almost $5, folks. Okay? Thanks for joining me on this morning's Morning Musings. We got more, and we'll see you on the flip side.